Now, the reason that falls down at the first set of examination is a gender recognition certificate is not how you access a single-sex space.
They're accusing each other of playing politics, but I don't think they are, actually. I think there's a genuine desire in the Scottish Parliament, whatever the Scottish voters think, to change the law, to have a different legal framework on gender recognition. And there's a genuine problem in the United Kingdom government that this does, by the back door, intentionally or not, have an effect and change the law in the rest of the United Kingdom. So I think that it's just a genuine problem. And so I think the government are right to take the action that they're doing under what's called Section 35. But really some attention should be given amongst all the rhetoric flying around to, is there a solution to this where the Scottish Parliament passes the law again, but in such a way that it does not affect the law in the rest of the United Kingdom? And that ought to be worth looking at.
But why didn't they look at that? Why was that looked at before? Because this was presumably inevitable. That's where it smacks of bad faith, doesn't it? Because these things need to be ironed out before the law is passed.
Well, you would think so. And there is a different opinion, of course, as I understand it, where the Scottish government says, well, no, actually, this doesn't have the effect on the rest of the UK. But the best description of it that I've seen is actually in our newspaper this morning, the Times leading article, which sets it out very clearly. It says it means there will be two different mechanisms for obtaining a gender recognition certificate available in Britain. And that could lead to institutions being found guilty of a breach of equalities law if they refuse to recognise a Scottish certificate, thereby creating a new UK-wide rule. That is the nub of the problem. So why don't they pass a law in Scotland? I don't know exactly how it is drafted, but it ought to be clear in the law that it doesn't apply outside Scotland, or that where there is a conflict with the UK Equality Act, that the Equality Act is paramount. Yeah. There should be some sensible solution to this.
Yeah, whether what we'll arrive on is an interesting question. Kezia, you might make the argument this is a battle that Rishi Sunak's quite happy to fight because it's broadly within the culture war. It might be quite Nicola Sturgeon is quite happy to fight it because it's broadly in the Scotland should be independent space. Maybe it's trickier for Labour. I don't know if you heard our conversation with Lucy Powell. It felt like there's a bit of a lack of clarity between Scottish Labour and Westminster Labour on the whole issue of gender generally, perhaps.
Oh, sure. Look, and Keir Starmer isn't the first UK Labour leader to trample on the toes of Scottish Labour leaders. We've been here many times before. And I'm happy to get into that with you, Stig, but I'm afraid I've got to correct much of what William's just said. This bill does not change or interfere with the Equality Act. It couldn't do that. It wouldn't have been introduced into the Scottish Parliament if it did that, because every bill has to pass an initial test about whether it's within the bounds of the Scotland Act. If it did contravene the Equality Act, the UK government would have used Section 33 of the Scotland Act to strike it down using that mechanism for that reason. That's not what they've done. They're using Section 35, and I appreciate this is really technical, but what this section does is it says that it doesn't go beyond the devolved competency of the Scottish Parliament, but the effect of that bill might have an impact on how devolved law in England operates. So the idea being here, in a scenario, and I've yet to really hear MD set out a proper scenario, is that somebody could use the law in Scotland to change their gender in order to access, for example, a single-sex space in a prison in England. Now, the reason that falls down at the first set of examination is a gender recognition certificate is not how you access a single-sex space. There are still completely separate risk assessment processes for that, separate judgments made about that. The only thing a gender recognition certificate does is allow you to change your birth certificate. Now, we have promised to do this in Scotland for 6 years. I was the Labour leader that committed to the Labour Party to this that long ago. It's been the most consulted upon piece of legislation in the history of the Scottish Parliament. And I think this is deeply regrettable that we've allowed ourselves to get into a situation where it's now a constitutional football. And I'm sorry to say, because I'm a huge fan and a big supporter, Keir Starmer got it wrong on the telly on Sunday, and I'm afraid Lucy Powell got it wrong on the radio 10 minutes ago, because they're not over the detail of this. And that's really why they should just really have let the Scottish Labour Party defend the reasons they voted the way they did, and recognise the fact that this is a bill that was passed by 2/3 of MSPs, people from 5 political parties, including, by the way, 2 Conservative frontbenchers.
And I guess the question is, though, so in your view, is the Section 35 not valid, or is it valid?
So this is the first time it's been used in the history of devolution, this aspect of the Scotland Act. First time in 24 years of a Scottish Parliament that a Secretary of State has ever tried to strike down a piece of legislation that Scottish Parliament has passed. Now that's a really heavy action, leaving the First Minister to then decide whether she amends that piece of legislation or whether she takes a judicial review to challenge the decision the Secretary of State has taken. Now I suspect she'll do the latter. And when it gets to court, it will all fall on this idea of reasonableness. Are there reasonable grounds to expect that this bill will materially impact on how the law operates in England? Nothing to do with the Equality Act, but on how it might impact on devolved areas operate within England. Now, until we can see real proper scenarios about what the Secretary of State thinks that impact's going to be, I can't really answer that. But I'm really struggling as somebody who's followed this bill really closely, that's committed to the principles behind it, that's written about it extensively in the newspapers. I'm really struggling to see the really practical examples of what the Secretary of State is suggesting is so bad about the implication of this bill in England. They're not contesting its impact in Scotland, they're talking about England here, and that's why it's a huge constitutional issue.
Kezia, thank you so much for clarifying all of that. We were just absolutely rapt there listening to you. You clearly do. You're able to fill in a lot of the gaps because it is quite a complex area. We're going to move on now and talk about trust in the police, because Downing Street have said that faith in the police has been shattered after serving Met Police officer David Carrick pled guilty to numerous rape and sexual offences. William Hague, do you agree with Downing Street that faith in the police has been shattered?
Yes, I'm afraid I do. I think that's just I think it's what most of the country would think. And how can that faith now be rebuilt? It's going to be a long, painful, difficult process, actually. And how do you rebuild trust in any institution that's lost it with the public? Well, it takes time. They are really going to have to show that they've acted very decisively and have different procedures to make sure such cases are picked up much earlier. They're going to have to show a cultural change yet again, so that people really know, so that it's just part of the culture of the Met that this is not what you do. The kind of behavior that's being uncovered is something utterly repugnant to the entire culture of the force. And so that clearly hasn't been felt strongly enough. So this has got a huge leadership job for Sir Mark Rowley, who was very good. I think he's an excellent leader of the organisation, but he's got a massive task now.
Kezia, why do you think that we are, as William has said, constantly looking for and requiring a culture change in the Met, in the police, that never seems to come? What do we need to do to actually finally change the culture? I think presumably we need something quite radical.
Yeah, because it feels now endemic, Asma. I mean, it's absolutely frightening to think that there are, and I've seen two different reports, 800 or 1,000 individual police officers being investigated for misconduct. I mean, that's astonishing. This one example is absolutely astonishing. And what we have here fundamentally is an abuse of power that's been allowed to run for years. And we saw that with Sarah Everard, and I don't think there's a woman in the country who will ever forget her story or what she experienced, or be able to distill that down into what that is essentially, an abuse of power by institutions such as the police. How to get to grips with it, I do not know. We've changed, leadership at the top, but it's a rotten borough right through. What we do know, though, about how you build trust is that rules matter, consequences for breaking rules must matter. So every single one of those 800 or 1,000 investigations now has to be incredibly serious, incredibly thorough, and there's to be consequences for any breaches that those officers have been a part of.
As a woman, have you lost faith in the police?
No, but I understand many people that have and do because of how they've experienced it. I've got no personal experience of having been let down by the police. In fact, quite the opposite. On any occasion where I've had to, for example, complain about death threats as a politician, my personal experience is the police have taken it exceptionally seriously and have made me feel very safe and very well looked after. I don't know if that's because I'm in Scotland and the approach to policing in Scotland is culturally a little bit different, or whether I'm just lucky and these other women are incredibly unlucky. But I do know there's a huge problem with the Met.
Yeah, I think that's almost an understatement, isn't it? Let's move on to the World Economic Forum. It's in full swing in Davos, sometimes described as the greatest intersection of wealth and political power on the global calendar, where billionaires rub shoulders with the likes of Ursula von der Leyen and Olaf Scholz, the lucky devils, and more especially, the true highlight of the World Economic Forum at Davos is, of course, William Hague. He's dusting off his ski boots and heading there as we speak. William, can you make a case for Davos as a good thing in the world?
Yes, I can. I can see why people make fun of it and criticize it. And as I've explained in my column this way, when I was in government, I didn't used to go, actually. I thought I went to enough international conferences. The case for it, there's a stronger case for it in the world than there's ever been, actually, because when you look at the extraordinary pace of change in the world economy and the technologies that are being invented, governments and businesses really need to understand each other. You know, I say in my column this morning, the United States is determined to lead the world in semiconductors, and China in solar panels, and the EU in batteries and so on. And this requires governments to say, well, we're going to give you the environment where you can come and invest in this country. And it requires businesses to say, okay, we're really going to put our faith in that country. So you've got to have the understanding between the business and political worlds for that to happen. And it's a good thing, therefore, that those people speak to each other without all the hangers-on, let's put it that way, with all the retinues. That's the one good thing about Davos one of the good things is you do bump into lots of people who don't have all their normal staff and minders around them, so you get to know what they really think.
But is it politically harder to do that now? It's striking that Rishi Sunak, who strikes me as a bit of a Davos man, if you had to sort of pick a description of him, he's not going there because everyone will say he doesn't know how the other half live. Macron's not there, Biden's not there, Xi's not there. I wonder whether actually that argument, which is very cogent, William, doesn't work in a cost of living crisis.
Well, I think in Rishi's case, he's the new prime minister. He's getting on top of so many issues, some of which we've been talking about in this program. Now, if I was him in this situation, 2 months into the job, I would stay in Downing Street and stay and keep getting on top of all these issues. But I think in general and in more settled times, it's good for a mixture of political leaders to go. It doesn't mean they all go every year. I think there are about 50 heads of government, so that's a quarter of the countries of the world going there this time, and about 600 chief executives of global corporation. And then there are people like me who are just going to see what they're all on about.
Are you going as a journalist or as a former foreign secretary?
No, I'm going as chair of the Royal Foundation, actually. So in my charitable role.
Okay, you're moving in a shaker. Kezia, you buying William's argument here for Davos?
Yes, I'm wondering if I can come as part of his entourage. Yeah. It sounds like he might need some friends and allies to take on all these meetings. I do think it's important. I actually think it's a really natural environment for Rishi Sunak to be in. These are his people. He's a multi-millionaire. He's made his money through business. He's married to a billionaire. He's never going to be able to shake off that look or that reputation. So he might as well own it and make the best of it and learn from some of the pioneering industries and businessmen from around the world about what is next, what is coming, so that he can make sure that the legislation he passes and the government that he leads is best able to respond to what's coming our way.
But you can perhaps understand why. You can imagine the grief he'd get if he'd gone.
Yeah, but he's going to get lots of grief anyway. I'd much rather right now he was in Davos speaking to rich people than interfering in Scotland's constitution.
Well put.
It might be the same as baseball. Before you go, will you be buying? What's it like there? What's the food like? I read somewhere that someone paid, what was it, $50 for a salad?
Oh, it's terrible.
Is it?
Yeah, no, everything's outrageously expensive. It's absolutely freezing. You slither around on pavements, getting from one thing to another. You're constantly having to check your coat in and get it back again. No, it's all a nightmare. But nevertheless, you go to lots of interesting things, and you come away with some fresh thoughts. And next year, I think Kezia should come with me because they could really do with hearing from Kezia.
Yeah.